We begin this hour with an interview that gave some insight into Doge's operations within the federal government, but not really. This time, as the newly formed agency still faces multiple lawsuits. In a Fox News interview alongside President Trump, which aired last night, Elon Musk defended Doge's work to cut costs.
I guess we must be over the target of doing something right. You know, if like they wouldn't be complaining so much if we weren't doing something useful, I think. But what all we're really trying to do here is restore the will of the people through the president. And what we're finding is that there's an unelected bureaucracy. One of the biggest functions of the Doge team is just making sure that the presidential executive orders are actually carried out.
I want to bring in CBS News White House reporter. That's Nancy Cordes, who's joining us now. It says Aaron Navarro in the prompter, Nancy, but you're not Aaron Navarro. It's good to have you, my friend. Okay.
I'll take that as a compliment, actually.
Yeah.
We're all big Aaron Navarro fans here.
We are indeed. We are. But I'm also a huge Nancy Cordes fan, so this is really cool. Nancy, let me ask you, only Sean Hannity can do an interview for an hour with the most powerful man in America and President Trump and not really make any news in the sense that this was billed as some kind of transparent interview where they were going to sort of give us the inner workings of what's happening with Doge, but we really didn't get anything. The president says Musk is the smartest person he knows. Musk says he's Trump's tech support. That's why he was wearing that corny T-shirt. So, but what did we really learn about what Doge is doing?
Right. You're definitely right that this was a friendly forum, shall we say, and a lot of the questions were variations on tell us why you are both so great and so smart and doing such important work and are so misunderstood. But it was interesting to watch the body language between Elon Musk and the president. Musk was very complimentary of President Trump, seems to be well aware of all the stories that have been out there about Trump ceding power to Musk and predicting that at some point Trump will grow tired of that. They even joked about all of those stories. And Musk and Trump really both defended the work that Musk is doing. He was wearing a T-shirt that said tech support, and he said it's basically there to carry out the president's vision and to make sure that what President Trump promised on the campaign trail becomes a reality. And President Trump, interestingly, said he relies on Musk very heavily to actually get things done. He says when he issues an executive order, it is Musk who actually makes sure that those executive orders get implemented at the various agencies. So he seemed quite content with Musk's role, quite reliant on him, despite some of the questions that have started popping up, even from some Republicans, about the work that Doge is doing and the speed with which it's doing it, which has led to not only some lawsuits, but some questionable decisions.
So, yeah, the question I have, Nancy, is, and I get it, Elon Musk has said that, you know, their goal is to get in there and break things, right? And they are doing that with some level of speed. But when you have instances like this nuclear agency where they fired a bunch of people and we didn't realize that they were responsible for safeguarding America, essentially, and then they had to go back and rehire those folks. I mean, those are the kinds of the questions that I would wonder if lawmakers want to talk to Elon Musk about. And also, you covered Congress for a long time. I'm also very curious about, as these cuts happen in these agencies, where oftentimes these government workers are based in cities across America, both rural, both red and blue states, if some of those lawmakers are going to say, hey, you know what, the funding that was supposed to fund whatever it is that is important in my district, that shouldn't be cut. We should only be cutting what's being done in woke New York City or woke LA. What kind of conversations are happening that way?
Right. You know, one of the things that Musk said in the interview last night was that you have to shrink the bureaucracy in order for President Trump's vision to be realized, because so many government workers are Democrats who are trying to undermine Trump's vision. And he said, just look at D.C. He said, I think about it all the time, the fact that 92% of residents in Washington, D.C. voted for Kamala Harris. That's the federal government. And, you know, he didn't acknowledge that so many federal workers live not in D.C., not even in Maryland or Virginia, but across the country. This move fast and break things philosophy that he is employing when it comes to the federal government is really central to Musk's philosophy at all of his companies. In the biography that was written about Musk by Walter Isaacson, he talks over and over again about the fact that Musk really believed that you had to make quick decisions, you had to move fast, and that meant inevitably that you would make mistakes and that you would have to reverse some of those decisions, but that it was still worth it in order to get things done. That's a very different proposition when you're talking about a private company that you control versus a federal government with a lot of moving parts that's trying to ward off things like, say, the bird flu.
Yeah. Nancy, really quickly before you go, I mean, any reaction from the White House to what Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has said, which is that President Trump is giving out misinformation in interviews that he's giving, where he suggested that the war in Ukraine was started by the Ukrainians. And the question becomes, of course, does the president not know? Does he not remember? Or is he just buying into the propaganda that Vladimir Putin is feeding him? Why would he say the Ukrainians are responsible for starting the war, even though he's obliquely suggesting that they should have accepted whatever the Russians wanted to do in the case of Ukraine's sovereignty? But I don't understand why he would say that.
It's hard to say, but it does definitely fit into a pattern with the president of the United States, where he tends to assign more blames, it seems, to the Ukrainians than to the Russians, who are the ones who actually invaded. And in a Q&A with reporters yesterday, he even went a step further and said that the president of Ukraine shouldn't be criticizing Trump's decisions because his approval rating is now down to 4%, which it is not, Vlad. It is actually at about 50%, very similar to President Trump's approval rating here in the United States. So I'm not sure whether he believes these claims when he makes them, or if he's simply saying them because they fit in with his worldview. But there's no question it's causing a lot of frustration, not just in Ukraine, but among a lot of U.S. allies in Europe.
Yeah, indeed. All right, Nancy Cordes, thank you very much. Say hi to Aaron if you see him.